Hello, welcome to the seminar series. Today is my pleasure to introduce Maxime Eeraerts. Probably I'm not pronouncing it correctly, but it's a challenging one. Maxime just joined EBD, in fact, due to paperwork issues. He will start actually tomorrow, but he will join the group, and he has a lot of experience in crop pollination, and today we're going to learn a lot about blueberry pollination. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Do I need to use the mic, or can everybody hear me correctly? Okay, so thanks for the introduction, Nacho. So I'm Maxime from Belgium, and I mainly do applied research with a holistic approach to gain knowledge and spread this within an academic but also within a stakeholder network, hence the applied approach. And I've studied these, my interest in these topics at various institutes. So I did my PhD at Ghent University in Belgium. Then I went to Washington State for 9 months to do a postdoc there. I then transitioned to Michigan State for a 1-year postdoc, and then I went back to Belgium, to Ghent University, to a different lab, to again do more research, and then now I'm at EBD. And what I will present today mainly comes from the work that I did in the United States, which was all about blueberry pollination, which I will also introduce a little bit. And I also had the slides, so that was easy, but I updated it in order to contrast some of the interesting results with some apple research that we did at Ghent University, and to contrast the findings, which I think is interesting. So I will talk about pollination, and pollination is the formation of fruits and seeds starting from the flower, and this is facilitated in the crops that I work with by insects. So insects transfer pollen from the anther of a flower to the stigma of a flower. That can be the same flower sometimes, but quite often also other flowers from the same or different plants. Yeah, there are other methods of pollinating like wind and water, but we will not go into detail about that, and that's also not relevant for the crops that I work with. So if you talk about insect pollinators, we can distinguish multiple species or groups, and the first one to mention is the honeybee, which most people know. In Europe we have one species of honeybee, which and a lot of genotypes. Then there are wild bees, so these are the bumblebees and the solitary bees. And to give you an idea, in Belgium we have around 25 species of bumblebees and 340 species or more of solitary bees. And then there are also a lot of other insect pollinators like flies, butterflies and beetles. Important for the presentation today, and also for certain conservation and crop pollination studies, is the distinction between the honeybee and the other pollinators. So the honeybee, especially in our regions, is a managed pollinator. It is nearly extinct in the wild in Europe. So it is tended by beekeepers, which they keep the colony in the boxes and they produce honey, and without the care of the beekeepers, these colonies don't do pretty well. The other pollinators, the bumblebees, the solitary bees, the hoverflies, the flies, the butterflies, they mainly are wild pollinators, so they occur naturally in the landscape, depending on the carrying capacity of the landscape. And throughout the last decades, we have seen multiple studies about crop pollination, and there have been some important meta-analysis or synthesis of these studies, and two important ones are the Garibaldi meta-analysis and that one of Matteo Danese, and they combined the data of 41 and 52 studies respectively, and these were studies, multiple site studies, so in each of the crop fields the pollinators were surveyed, so you had honeybee abundance, wild bee abundance, wild pollinator richness, etc. And then in all of those fields these studies measured pollination. And what these studies typically then try to do is look for patterns between pollinators and pollination success. And what these studies did, so the synthesis, they looked for general patterns if we combine all those data. And one common and interesting pattern that the synthesis have found is that with increasing wild pollinator richness and increasing abundance of these wild pollinators, here on the x-axis you see that pollination success in those fields increases. This pattern was not detected for honeybees by these first syntheses, but as time went on, more studies and more data was collected, and a new synthesis of Riley et al. In 2024 combined the data of 93 studies, so almost doubling the amount of data. And what they found was that both wild pollinators and honeybees actually contribute equally to crop pollination at the global scale. The nice thing about this study was that they put their data and code online, and I then, with some colleagues, went into the data and explored if this relationship is linear, which to that point most of the synthesis assumed, or if this relationship is not linear, if it's asymptotic or hump-shaped, if you see that it would go down after increasing pollination visitation, pollinator visitation. And what we found is that also these contributions of honeybees and wild bees are equal, but the relationship is asymptotic. So pollination success increases with increasing pollinator visitation, but with decreasing increments. Another really interesting topic to introduce as background, and also to illustrate the relevance of studying pollination after so many studies have already done it, is by looking at the area of land that is cultivated in agriculture through time. And here on the x-axis we see the years starting from the 1960s, and in the y-axis we see the percentage of change of the total area of crops worldwide. And this brown area, this brown line, shows that throughout time in the last decades the area of crops has been increasing. What this study also looked at is they focused on the area of crops that depend on insect pollinators. And here they noticed, as you can see on the yellow line, that the area of crops that depends on insect pollinators has been increasing more strongly compared to the total area of crops. And from this we conclude that there's an increasing dependence on insect pollinators in agriculture. And this can be explained by two possible explanations. The first is that since the 1990s we've seen an expansion of biofuel crops by the creation of government subsidies to plant oil seed crops like sunflower and oilseed rape in order to make biofuels of those crops. And these crops, of course, they rely on insect-mediated pollination in order to produce a high production. Another explanation is the expansion of crops outside their historic production region. And in the last decades we have seen that for certain crops like blueberry and avocado, who depend on insect pollination, that these crops have expanded massively outside their historic production region. And this figure illustrates this point really nicely. So this is data from the International Blueberry Organization, who is an organization that keeps really good track of the data of hectares and production of blueberry. And here you see on the x-axis again the time since the early 2000s. They've kept track of the total amount of hectares of planted highbush blueberry fields. And you see at the start here that it is mainly North America, so the United States and Canada, that were producing and cultivating highbush blueberry. So the plant Vaccinium corymbosum is native to North America, so it's also a bit logical that the production started there. But what you see very spectacularly, if you focus on today, for instance, the North American area of cultivation has increased a little bit, but it's stabilizing. But we also see that certain areas like Central and South America, also Eastern Europe, and definitely Asia have increased their production in really massive amounts, whereby China now is the greatest producer of blueberries, together with countries like Peru and Chile. So this expansion of crops outside their production area really supports the point that agriculture is increasingly depending on insect pollinators. And here from this report I also added the figure that they made for Spain. What you can see is here data from the last 10 years, and we can conclude that in the last 10 years the area of highbush blueberry has tripled in Spain, and this is mainly in the region I think of Huelva, if I pronounce it correctly. So also here in Spain this is a relevant crop. So if you then look at the flowers of blueberry, these are quite particular flowers if you compare it to apple or oilseed rape. These are bell-shaped flowers, and the pollen is contained in poricidal anthers. And poricidal anthers, in order to release the pollen, they need to be vibrated. And this vibration can be performed by certain pollinators. So for instance, bumblebees are very good at this buzz pollination, but honeybees, who are the main managed insect pollinator in agriculture, they cannot do this. So the question is if they can really pollinate blueberry effectively. When it comes to solitary bees, some species can do this, some cannot. Buzz pollination by flies or beetles, to my knowledge, is not described. And also important to note is that highbush blueberry is self-compatible, so it can successfully fertilize and produce seeds and fruits without cross-pollination. So it can self-pollinate, so you don't per se need different cultivars in order to facilitate cross-pollination and to facilitate yield. Then we can ask if pollination is successful in different crops in the world, and this is being done in many studies, and this is a figure of a really nice study in the United States. Again, in different crops and different states, they assessed the degree of pollen limitation by comparing flowers in open fields that have been supplemented by hand with pollen and just ambient open flowers. And this pollen limitation is then comparing the hand and the open pollination flowers, and you get then a degree. This pollen limitation is a degree of suboptimal pollination, or is a degree of what a farmer is missing. And you see on the graph that apples, cherries and blueberries in different states suffer from suboptimal pollination. So we can then ask for blueberry, how can we optimize pollination in these fields? And we went through the literature and we found a lot of conflicting results. Positive effects of more honeybees on blueberry pollination and yield, negative effects of honeybees on yield and pollination, positive effects of wild bees, no effect of wild bees, etc. So this then brought us to the idea of making a data synthesis of the blueberry pollination literature. So what I will present today is the key results of this synthesis, and also some new empirical work. So the main questions for today are: which insects pollinate highbush blueberry, and how do honeybees and wild bees contribute to its pollination? And then to end with, I will present some results or insights on how to manage both honeybees and wild bees for crop pollination. And so the first two questions I will mainly focus on the blueberry synthesis work and then contrast with some work that we did in an apple synthesis as well in Ghent. So yeah, I think it was 2021, I conducted a systematic literature review and we found 72 studies on insect-mediated pollination in highbush blueberry. What you clearly see, so the map indicates the number of studies in each country, and what you clearly see is that there's a big focus or geographical bias from the United States. So 60%, a bit more, of the studies come from there. And this, of course, is not unlogical because that's also the place where historically this crop is cultivated, so that's why people mainly have studied it there. Within the United States, you also see a big geographical bias in the Northeast because there, 100 years ago, more or less, the breeding started of the commercial cultivars. So, in order to answer the first question, which insects pollinate blueberry, we found 39 of the 72 studies conducted a pollinator survey in open fields. And from these studies, we extracted the relative abundance or the relative visitation to blueberry flowers of honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies. On this graph, you see the relative abundance of honeybees here, and then bumblebees, solitary bees, and hoverflies. So each gray dot is an average value of a study, and the red dots indicate the mean, the overall mean. So we see clearly a dominance of honeybees visiting these flowers. Honeybees, I already mentioned, they cannot buzz pollinate, so they don't forage on blueberry for pollen, but they can extract a lot of nectar. So they mainly visit blueberry for nectar. What we also see for the wild pollinators, we see more bumblebees, less solitary bees, and almost no hoverflies. I did not find sufficient studies on other pollinators, so they are not included. We also see a large variation between studies as well of these abundances. If we then go to the second question, how do honeybees and wild bees pollinate or contribute to the pollination of highbush blueberry? We had a subset of studies, again of the 72 studies. 26 data sets were found that had multiple sites in which the pollinators and pollination were measured. And from these studies, we requested the raw data, and they totaled up to 585 total blueberry fields. And so just simply speaking, the data that we collected for these analysis are honeybee visitation and then wild bee visitation, so bumblebee and solitary bee visitation. I split up for this presentation, and then fruit set, seed set, and fruit weight. I will mainly focus on seed set because fruit set and fruit weight respond quite similar, and also seed set is the main pollination proxy in my opinion. I then z-scored standardized the data by study level and then did general linear model analysis. So these figures will then show the relationships between, on the left, honeybee visitation, bumblebee visitation in the middle, and then solitary bee visitation and their effect on seed set. And what we found is a clear contribution for both honeybees and bumblebees on seed set, yet we did not find this for the solitary bees on the right. So if you have more honeybees in your field, the seed set increases, and if you have more bumblebees, we see the same. And these two are not correlated. These three are not correlated, so that's I find this an interesting result because most studies, they just lump the wild bees separately, together. So I'll now contrast these results with what we found with a synthesis in apple. So here I again conducted a systematic literature review and requested all the data of all the site replicated studies. So together we found 31 data sets totaling 461 apple orchards. You clearly see the distribution of these two crops is geographically where they originate from is quite different. The apple studies, they are mainly coming from Europe, but there's a bit, the spread is a bit more uniform, not uniform, but a bit more spread out. Interesting as well, if we would update this, we would find more and more studies outside the United States for blueberry and outside Europe for apple as well. So who visits apple? Again, the same figure for honeybees, bumblebees, solitary bees and hoverflies, the relative visitation of those 31 studies. We see a dominance of honeybees similar to blueberries. What we also see for the wild pollinators is compared to blueberry, we see less bumblebees in apple and more solitary bees, and also we see more hoverflies. But again, we see a large variation across the studies. If we then look at the contributions of honeybees, bumblebees and solitary bees, for apple we did not detect this relation of honeybees and bumblebees and their effect on seed set, but we did see these effects of solitary bees. So we saw if you have more solitary bees visiting the apples in your fields, your seed set will increase. So this contrasting result, I think, is very interesting, both from an ecological point of view, but also from a management point of view and formulating guidelines for pollination. It clearly shows that the guidelines for pollination need to be different for different crops. So the wild bee contribution that we find for blueberry and apple, so the bumblebees and the solitary bees, is in line with the synthesis that I showed at the start of the presentation. And we can explain this by the fact that wild bees are more efficient pollinators in general. They are better at cross-pollinating and depositing the right amount or the right type of pollen. And for blueberry in particular, we also know from literature that bumblebees are more efficient on a single visit basis than solitary bees, and solitary bees are more efficient than the honeybees. And for apple, this is the opposite for solitary bees and bumblebees. Here the solitary bees are more efficient and the honeybees are least efficient. But then this honeybee contribution in blueberry, they cannot buzz pollinate, so and they are not good at cross-pollination as well, so how can we explain the fact that we still see this positive contribution? Because it's not in line with at least the first synthesis. And this interesting study by George Hoffman they conducted a study whereby in blueberry fields they caught a lot of honeybees that were visiting the blueberry flowers, and on those honeybees they inspected the different body parts, so the head and the abdomen, the legs, the claws, the tarsi separately, and they went to look for is there pollen on these body parts, because they might still accidentally pick up bits of pollen and then also deposit this pollen, and they find that I do not know the numbers by heart, but they did find a lot of pollen on the head and the claws and the tarsi. And if you see how a honeybee, this is also if a honeybee visits a blueberry flower, they crawl from flower to flower and they attach their legs and different body parts touch the stigma sometimes. So in this way there's a mechanism whereby the honeybee still deposits pollen on the flowers, and this in combination with the high abundance of honeybees, so they are the dominant pollinator, and also the fact that blueberry is self-compatible, it does not require cross-pollination, brings us to the explanation that honeybees can also pollinate blueberry, at least highbush blueberry. So this is the main conclusion from this part. Honeybees and bumblebees contribute considerably to blueberry pollination, and for apple it are mainly the solitary bees. So then, knowing this contribution of the different pollinators, how do we then advise farmers to manage pollination? And here two approaches can be taken. So for the blueberries, for sure, we can do this with honeybees, and this is, you contact beekeepers and you rent honeybee hives that they come and put in your field for 1 week or a couple of weeks. Or you manage pollination by managing wild pollinators, and this is by creating habitat in the landscape or by creating, planting hedges or planting wildflower strips in order to improve the landscape quality around your field. And for the first, I will now tell some insights about the wild pollinator management. So this wild bee management, a lot of studies have studied this topic, how that the landscape influences wild bees in agricultural fields. And here the general conclusion is that if you have more wild habitat around your fields, you find more wild bees and wild pollinators that visit your crop. But this more is better relationship is not really a tangible or quantitative guideline for policymakers and also for farmers to work with. So then a lot of people have, at least policymakers and scientists have suggested that we need habitat thresholds, minimum amounts of habitat that are needed to ensure that we have sufficient wild pollinators or in general biodiversity in agricultural landscapes. And here the European biodiversity strategy of 2030 has aimed to conserve 30% of habitat in landscapes. Depending on how you read the document, they can also state that it is only 10%. We have also seen an important perspective that suggests that we need 20% of natural habitat in agricultural landscapes. And in order to answer this question from a pollinator conservation point of view, a recent study has been published by Gabriela Bishop from Wageningen, and they try to answer this this question of how much habitat is needed. And I will not go into detail about their approach because it's a bit complicated. But what you see on this figure for bumblebees and solitary bees, they found that 18 to 16% of habitat is needed to have viable and good pollinator populations within your landscapes. And I also tried to answer this question a little bit, but from a pollination management point of view. So my data, the data that I used was data from my PhD in cherry orchards. And what I did there is, instead of modeling this relationship between natural habitat here on the x-axis and on the y-axis, the wild pollinators on the cherries, instead of modeling this as a linear relationship, I tried to model this as a non-linear relationship. And on the figure you see the result of a segmented relationship. And here, with this segmented regression, I could determine that 15% of natural habitat is needed around the cherry orchards in order to facilitate adequate or sufficient wild pollinator visitations within the cherry orchards. So this segmented regression also shows that if you go from 0 to 15% natural habitat, your pollinator visitation of wild pollinators increases very clearly. If you go beyond that, it's not clear anymore. So the interesting point is that both studies, so from the pollinator conservation point of view and the pollination point of view, and different methods, we concluded similar amounts of habitat for wild pollinators in landscapes. So then on to the honeybee management topic, and this is, in my opinion, an aspect where we have still a lot of remaining questions, and this honeybee management, in my opinion, is not studied thoroughly enough compared to the importance that this one species of pollinator has. So there are a lot of remaining questions. How many hives do we need per field for a certain crop? What's the importance of the quality of hives? Do we need big hives, big strong hives, or small strong hives? Do we need to manage this hive density at the field scale or at the landscape scale, because that's also very important. The wild pollinators, they stick closer to their nest, 500 meters, something like that, whereas the honeybees, they go up to 2-3 kilometers to find nectar and pollen. And of course, this spatial scale is way beyond the spatial scale of an agricultural field. And this graph also shows the recommended honeybee hive densities for different crops. But this data comes from a very old publication, a book, which actually, you can question if this is still relevant today. But then the question I want to answer or present to you now is if it is best to manage the honeybee hive density at the field scale or at the landscape scale. So if you want sufficient honeybees, or if you want to know the amount of honeybees in our study field, what spatial scale do we need to take into account? So in order to answer this question, we set up a study in Washington State. So here is Vancouver, and here below is Seattle, not on the map. So we selected 16 blueberry fields, the red dots on the map. For each field, we mapped the landscape. So we mapped the amount of natural habitat and arable land, but we also mapped the percentage of highbush blueberry for the reason that this is the only crop that is flowering at that time and that is stocked with honeybee hives. And we mapped this blueberry amount on the ground. We checked every field to make sure that if the map is correct. And we did this at various spatial scales. So the map shows the 1 kilometer spatial scale, the 750, 500, 250. We then visited all these blueberry fields of all the 16 sites, around all the 16 sites. We did this during mid-bloom of the cultivar that we were sampling, so Duke, in order to make sure that the pollinator transect and the hive mapping corresponded, that we have accurate numbers that match. So we mapped the number of hives in our focal study fields and also in all the blueberry fields around it. We then also walked transects in each field, and here we measured the pollinators by catching them from the flowers if they are visiting flowers. We did this during mid-bloom, and we caught all honeybees and wild bees, and we did this for 2 hours per field. So some general numbers of this study is that the field level hive density, so of the central field, ranged from 3.5 to 25 hives per hectare with a mean of 12. So this upper limit is very, very high. The landscape level hives in total in the 16 fields and within their 1 kilometer radius, we located more than 6,000 hives. And this landscape level hive density between the different fields ranged from 16 to 920 with an average of 400. And we caught more than 1,000 honeybees ranging from 44 to 114, and we only caught 54 wild bees, so that's really a low number, and this ranged from 0 to 14 with an average of 3, so not a lot of wild bees, definitely relative to other studies. So first interesting result is that we find a strong correlation between the amount of blueberry in the landscape and the amount of hives in the landscape. And what we then also found is that the amount of hives within a 1 kilometer radius is the main predictor of our honeybee visitation within our focal field, and that the field level hive density had no clear effect on this field, on this honeybee visitation within our field. What we also found is that honeybee visitation was linked clearly positively to the number of seeds per berry again. So using this collection of data, we now need to determine again the thresholds of hive density that are needed to obtain optimal yield or maximum yield and optimal pollination. And again, we have not done this yet. but it would be really relevant to be able to say to farmers 6 hives per hectare is enough, and those that are putting 25 hives per hectare are putting way too many hives within the fields, which then also has cascading or negative effects on the wild pollinator communities. So yeah, that was all I had to say. So some take-home messages. Bumblebees, both honeybees and bumblebees contribute to pollination of highbush blueberry. The pollination contribution of honeybees and wild bees is clearly crop specific. We also need habitat thresholds to inform not only pollinator conservation but also pollination management by wild bees. And honeybee visitation is determined by the landscape level hive density, and that field level hive density recommendations miss these contributions. And with that, I would like to thank all my collaborators from the different states and the different funding agencies, and you for your attention. And if you have some questions, I think we have a little bit of time for that. So thanks.